So I want to welcome everyone to the sixth webinar in the CCL Action Team, Agriculture Action Team's webinar series entitled Bringing Agriculture to the Table to talk about carbon extraction and storage. And my name is Jan Storm, and I'm here on behalf of CCL's Ag Action Team. And just a brief background in case someone who hasn't been on before is on. The background for these webinars is that we as CCLers who do our work by building informed relationships realized that two things really. Not only did we have to educate ourselves a little bit about agriculture in order to engage in meaningful discussion with those in the agriculture sector. But like more and more thought leaders and scientists, we also recognize that putting a price on carbon, which is what we really exist for, is really not enough. That we also have to start taking carbon, extracting carbon that's in the atmosphere and storing it long-term through agricultural practices. And that's what sustainable or regenerative agriculture does. So in these webinars, we've had 5 webinars. We've heard from a number of speakers about practices and policies and advocacy focused on encouraging regenerative practices. I think that's been really, really informative. Tonight, we are fortunate, very fortunate, we'll hear from a completely different but very important voice in agriculture. So we're very fortunate to have Greg Page, who's the retired CEO of one of the largest agribusiness companies in the US, to provide some remarks for us. And in just a minute, I'm going to invite Tom to give us a little bit of introductory background on Mr. Page.
So thank you, Jan, and thank you, Mr. Page, and all of you attending now and those who are listening to this after the fact. So I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Page. We thought, well, perhaps if we invite someone in a leadership role that our representative might be interested in a face-to-face meeting. And so we found a retiree, as I like to explain to others, the just retired CEO and chairman of Cargill. And that was an incredibly effective meeting. So I really appreciated the time that both Mr. Page and our representative could bring to that. Mr. Page has had a 42-year career with Cargill. He's held positions in the United States, in Singapore, Thailand, in animal nutrition, poultry processing, beef and pork processing, and financial markets. In 2007, he was elected CEO. He received his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of North Dakota. And that idea to invite him in came from one of the alumni who was our chapter lead for Chaska. Greg also helped put a valuable dose of agricultural business experience into the Risky Business Report. And one of the things we observed in April was that as he talked to farmers as part of his work and talked to members of Congress, that he had perhaps some good hints and tips for us about how that works too. And so I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Greg Page. And sir, thank you very much for your help tonight. Take it away.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Jan. I was asked to make a few comments and then leave a lot of time for questions about 3 topics. First, perspectives on agribusiness shareholders, stakeholders' concerns about climate change risk. Second, about what specific policies intended to mitigate climate risk they view as being in their interests. And third, how CCLers can engage agribusiness stakeholders in a respectful discussion about these topics. And I think that's an incredibly worthy goal. So in order, I will take those 3 questions. First, a little context about Risky Business 1, which was a project funded by Hank Paulson, Mayor Bloomberg, and Tom Steyer, hired some really excellent people that looked at climate change through the lens of financiers, which clearly the three gentlemen that funded the work. They then had an advisory board made up of 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats to serve as a sounding board for the work of the professional staff. And Risky Business One basically used a risk lens versus just a climate lens and talked about it. They looked at 5 parts of the economy. One was agriculture, and Cargill was invited as a result of the importance of that to Risky Business One. Key findings in that, in a more likely than not scenario, we were going to face significant stress to our agricultural productivity in the absence of adaptation, and that language was used repeatedly because certainly we have seen adaptation all over the world. We'll talk a little bit about how much climate has changed already, and farmers have tried to stay in step with that through both good research, better genetics, and changes in their agronomic practices. So in a more likely than not scenario, clearly Texas and the mid-south of the United States is going to face fairly significant agricultural stress absent adaptation. On the other side of the coin, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and certainly the Canadian prairie provinces will probably enjoy, during the balance of this century, on average, better conditions for practicing photosynthesis. Interestingly, too, the Pacific coast has a more likely than not opportunity to also enjoy some benefits. But the net for the U.S. Absent adaptation would be a fairly stressed food security situation and certainly ag economics. A couple of points to keep in mind: that all of the temperature increase that we've seen so far has come from higher lows, not from higher highs. And I point that out because it's really important in agriculture. It's the high highs that are really frightening because they interfere with pollination. The higher lows bring some negatives as well, but they also bring some positives in terms of longer effective growing seasons. In recorded history, the longest growing season ever in Minnesota was last year, with over 200 days between frosts, which, when you consider we're above the 45th parallel, is absolutely incredible. The other thing about the report that points out is that we are likely to see more rainfall in much of the ag belt of the United States, but it's going to happen in fewer events. So we're going to have more than 3, 4, and 5 type downpours, and we will get more total rain, but we're going to have to learn to deal with it in fewer events. And this is where the interests of people that want to mitigate and the people that want to adapt to change interests come into alignment, because the best single thing we can do in agriculture to deal with rainfall that's coming in larger doses in fewer events is to have more organic matter in our soil. The rule of thumb is basically for every 1% increased carbon we can have in our soil, we can hold about 1 inch additional water. So restoring the 4 or 5% of carbon that we've lost, it clearly varies by area, but a good number to use. I think a big part of the important agricultural zones of the U.S. have an opportunity to restore, call it 4 to 5% carbon to their soil with change practices. And I won't seek to be an agronomist tonight because I'm not, and I understand some of your other webinars have had those people, but this is within our grasp. Clearly, it takes purposeful changes in the behavior, the use of cover crops, increased use potentially of perennials, being really mindful of which land we're farming. There are a host of actions that need to be taken, but the interests of farmers in having more organic matter and the interests of environmentalists and people that believe in climate change and the opportunity for mitigation all should see an aligned interest in regard to changing the composition of our soil. It's a win-win for ag, and it's a win-win for total greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Along with that, it's also a win for food consumers around the world, as we'll put a lot more resilience back into our farm country. The point I would make, because occasionally I've been criticized for leaving a somber tone on what the potential to feed the world is, that as long as there's sunlight, we are going to have the opportunity to feed ourselves, because we'll have all the opportunities necessary to have photosynthesis. And so the fact that we won't have food, to me, is quite far-fetched. The thing that needs to be understood, however, is we have taken, just in the last 40 years, the percent of global GDP represented by the farm gate value of the most important crops, in which there are 16 that provide most of our calories and most of our protein. Those 16 crops in the 1970s represented 4% of global GDP. Today, that number's fallen to about 2% of global GDP. Clearly, as agriculture faces more stress and is compelled to employ ever more expensive practices to feed everyone, that percentage could rise. And what we'll end up with is economic malnutrition as a result of the cost of food rising, not the inability of agriculture at some price to provide those calories. And so I think as people think about these policies, it's important to separate the economic reality of a more expensive agriculture as a percent of the total GDP pie versus the inability of photosynthesis to provide all the calories and grams of protein that we need to nourish ourselves. So hopefully that will be one of the takeaways that you will have from this call. So to the third point, which is how can CCLers engage agribusiness stakeholders in a respectful discussion? I've basically, since joining Mayor Bloomberg and Hank, in an effort to improve the quality of the discussion around climate change, had a chance to meet with a lot of audiences, and some less friendly to this topic than other. And my goal in talking to the farm community is primarily to get people from being deniers to being discussers. It's not to immediately get people to change their mind. The second thing I've learned in over 3 years of going out and speaking with audiences is the difference between what most farmers will say to you at their kitchen table and what may be said in an audience of 600 or 700 people can be quite different. And at the base of that is the fact that there's a perception based on a lot of real life experiences that when you're dealing with the EPA as a farmer, that if you give an inch, you will lose a mile. And so much of the public discourse is much more strident than the discourse that you can have in small groups or with an individual farmer. They know how much the climate has changed in the 40 years that they've been farming, and they know how differently they farm than their fathers did. And so in that environment, there's a lot of confidence that if allowed to practice their craft, that they can adapt and change with the circumstances, but they will readily acknowledge that they've experienced enormous change during their farming life. And a reminder to everybody, the typical farmer only gets 40 chances to grow a crop in his entire life, and those are precious chances. And so this whole idea of avoiding a big debate about what caused it and really talking about what we should do about it, I think is one of the first takeaways for how we can engage agribusiness. The second one is to acknowledge that they've done a lot already. That I'll use corn as an easy example, and our largest crop by weight. We are using 40% less nitrogen, and nitrogen essentially is concentrated natural gas. And we use 40% less nitrogen to produce a bushel of corn today than we did when I started working at Cargill. We use 30% less feed to produce a pound of meat in our pork and in our chickens. And so it can go through a long list of things that have enormous positives in terms of the greenhouse gas footprint of the nutrition that's provided by farmers. And they feel that all the work they've done already goes unacknowledged, and an easy way to begin to enlist them and engage them in a respectful discussion is to acknowledge what's already gone on. And I think that's important. Second is just spend most of the energy on what should we do about it and less on what the causes were and any precise predictions of how warm it's going to be by what date, and really focus on what I call the morality of it, that irregardless of what you feel about mitigation, that agriculture, since it's necessary to human life, needs to adapt. That clearly this is an issue where the U.S. is not in control of its own destiny in that regard. We can do a lot of things, and the Risky Business Project calls for reducing our greenhouse gas footprint and shows a way to do that by 2050. And we'll talk just for a minute before I stop about that. But even having done that, depending on what the rest of the world does, we still need to have an enormous effort put in place for adaptation in the food production system. And so with that, I'll just switch over and talk just for a little moment about Risky Business 2. So the Risky Business 2 project was to map 4 pathways in the end, but the first question they were asked by Hank and Mayor Bloomberg and Tom was, could we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint by 80% by 2050? What would it cost? And does the technology exist, or is in reasonable visibility to us to deploy that? So is it functionally and technically possible to first decarbonize our electricity, and second, further electrify our economy, whereby we could reduce our greenhouse gas footprint by 80% by 2050? I encourage you to read it. It's very good. I've showed it to a number of CEOs of major utilities, and they think it stands the test of common sense. They think that the numbers in terms of capital investment required are in the realm of reason. They raise practical questions like, where are we going to get the technicians to do all this? Where are we going to get some of the rare earth minerals that are required to deploy these technologies? So there are some practical considerations they bring up, that the concept of further electrifying the economy and decarbonizing electricity, and to do it in the 33 years remaining for us to 2050, they see as entirely practicable. What's the cost of that? About 2.5% of GDP, continuously invested over the next 33 years to do it. $14 trillion. So when you say 2.5% to most audiences, particularly if they're predisposed to believe that climate change is a very real threat and a significant portion of it is man-caused, that seems like a reasonable cost to bear. On the other hand, when you personalize it and ask a person with a $100,000 family income if they're willing to invest $200 a month for the remaining 33 years of their working life to achieve that future, there are fewer hands that go up in most audiences. So it's the personalizing this 2.5% that is the work that needs to be done, and I and others are spending time trying to get that done. But there is a pathway there. Clearly, we would have to hope that other countries would emulate the decisions that we make by substituting, in essence, capital, $14 trillion of it, for carbon dioxide. The net benefit when you get to 2050 is we will have left $10 trillion worth of hydrocarbons in the ground. And so, again, the financial lens that the Risky Business team has brought to this discussion, I think, has been very valuable. First, Risky Business 1, what are the risks? And second, in the quantification of those. And then second, is there a pathway to an 80% reduction while maintaining our standard of living? And yes, there is. But this is the size of the investment. So with those preliminary remarks, Tom and Jan, I'd be glad to take people's questions.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a lot, actually, for my brain to absorb. But please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat room. I can start off. So in the most recent remarks that you made about Risky Business 2, and you talked about the capital investment. Could you elaborate a little bit on where that money where that money could come from, and two, is there a market-based price involved at all as a recommendation or as a possibility? And then three, I was thinking as you were talking, if people involved, any of the leaders involved in risky business too, are also among the Republicans that put forward the conservative case for carbon dividends at all. I feel like there might be an overlap there, but I could also be wrong.
No, we'll start with the last question first. George Shultz wrote very eloquently. I think James Baker joined him in a number of the op-ed pieces. Clearly, Hank has spoken. Hank and I met with the congressional, I don't know what they call it, the caucus, the climate caucus, which is made up of equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. A really enjoyable meeting, and much of the rancor you see on television was absent. And we had an hour and 45 minutes of incredibly professional and civil conversation with about 50 members of Congress. And it certainly encouraged me, I know, and encouraged Hank to continue being out there and talking about these things, because there are places where you can go and talk in a quality debate, in an equality forum. So Jan's talking about a revenue neutral carbon tax. Secretary George Shultz, the Hoover Institute, has written about it, the general premise of it for the U.S. economy. And there's a big debate about, and you asked about a market price for carbon. I happen to believe, based on looking at the returns on investment that both citizens and companies would need to have on their incremental investments to decarbonize their own footprint, is going to, for the last portion of that 80% reduction, is probably going to be at least $100 a ton. It need not start at that price, and in fact, we probably couldn't respond to it. And so Secretary Shultz has talked about starting at $20 or $30 a ton, but by having legislation that gave certainty to it, then have it sloping upward over time as people could adjust to it and make the investments. So what's the price? Clearly, the quickest way to determine the price is set the path to 80% reduction, in my opinion, use a cap and trade with no additional printing of certificates. The European approach to cap and trade really poisoned people's perceptions of how it worked, because every time the value of a carbon credit got close to 30 euros per ton, the French in particular just printed more of the certificates, and then it would go back to 10 or 12, which was a price below which it would incentivize the deployment of significant amounts of capital to reduce the footprint. And so the only way a cap and trade system can work is if there's certainty about it and people are prepared in advance to accept that the price of carbon will rise to a level that will cause people to change their behavior. And that's where politics and economics come crashing into each other. Second part of it, where will the money come from? There's basically the 2.5% is $400 billion a year. About $100 billion of it will be spent by individual citizens. When they buy a water heater, they will buy the best available technology at that time. And part of that $100 billion is the incremental cost of buying a higher efficiency unit. Similarly with air conditioning and furnaces, $60 billion of that will be spent on buying electric cars. And the presumption of the people that did the study is that electric propulsion will remain more expensive even as we get to scale in electric car production, versus internal combustion versus electric propulsion will be about a $3,000 delta, 17 to 20 million cars a year. So that's 60 million. Part of it will go into trucks, which will more likely be corporate, but it will be reflected in the rates. And the remainder of the money will by and large be invested on our behalf by utilities, but in effect it will be recaptured from all of us as citizens through our rates. And so the 400 billion will 1/4, and you can go on the website and see it in more detail, but the easy way to think about it, 1/4 of it, we will each as individuals be writing checks over the course. It does not require us to throw things away, but when we finally have an air conditioner that's failed, to replace it with the best available technology. there were people that wanted to move the date to 2040 and leave it at 80%, but the cost to do that goes up dramatically because by necessity you will be throwing away some assets that still have useful lives. So the basic premise of Risky Business 2 is to replace assets as their useful life expires, but to do it with the best available technology at that time. And then to decarbonize the electric industry. The size of the electric industry will get much bigger as we electrify transportation in particular, but we'll also be electrifying more of our home heating component and more of our industrial component. So there'll be a dramatic increase in the total amount of electricity produced in the US, but there'll be a decarbonization of that electricity over those 33 years. So hopefully that answers your question, where it will come from, what it'll be used for, what the market price is, according to Greg Page, at least $100 as we get to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting because that does your perspective and opinion does differ from the carbon fee and dividend approach, which that's really interesting. It's interesting to hear that argument for cap and trade, I think, put forward again, put at this point in time.
Yeah. And again, just to finish on the revenue neutral, I'm not saying it's not a good approach to it, and particularly if you could codify it into law where the carbon tax rose. I hope everybody in the call understands. If it was $100, which is for easy math, so $100 is $1 a gallon, which is the easiest way for a lot of people to think about it. A typical American drives 12,000 miles and buys 400 gallons of gas. So that right away, your electricity bill will go up about 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And so if people have their bills, they can look them up and see what it would cost. So the government would collect at $100 a ton, more or less $600 million, and would pay a dividend then back to people.
Mm-hmm.
So to call it 300 million people, so the dividend would be $2,000 a person. I think you can make the case that it will be a progressive tax. I've done my own carbon footprint. I would get two-person household times $2,000. I would receive $4,000 back in the dividend, and the implicit carbon tax in my standard of living is about $14,000 a year. So the net to me would be an incremental tax of $10,000. An urban middle-class person who could avail themselves of public transport would probably have a $1,000 to $1,200 bill, and they'd receive a $2,000 dividend. And so there will clearly be winners and losers in this transition, since it's collected per ton and it's distributed per capita. Maybe everybody on the call knows that, but I think it's worth keeping in mind if we're going to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, there are. This is interesting. There are a few more. There are a few comments on the chat, but I just want to ask you another sort of big question. So when you described conversations that you had with the Climate Solutions Caucus and other decision makers and policy makers. So from all of the sort of context that we've had up to this point has been more for the producer side. From the producer advocacy, we've had the the Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, the National Farmers Union. We had a Senate staffer from the Senate Ag Committee. We had a conservation forester. And so when in the halls of, this is my imagination, I'm never in the halls of big agribusiness, but when you're talking with your compatriots there, is there honestly discussion about either one of these, literally, a revenue neutral, putting an economy-wide price on carbon, and considering that with respect to the impact that is and will occur to agriculture, and kind of the moral imperative to take action, but yet we're not really hearing a chorus from agribusiness in general to take action. Are we just not hearing it, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I was nodding as you spoke until you got to the chorus. I think we have numerous duets.
Okay.
That we need to coalesce into a chorus at some point. But yes, I have sat in the kitchens of farmers or in the cabs of their combines and talked about the $1 a gallon and went through what it would, the 25 or 30 cents a bushel more it would cost to produce corn if at the moment that the carbon tax had risen to $100 absent adaptation, which they would fully do. And the number of farmers that are out there experimenting with different cover crops, with different tillage options. I happen to be on the board of directors at John Deere, and I know the amount of time we spend talking about the role of the implement providers in conservation agriculture. From a marketing standpoint, Cargill, as the person between the farmers and the branded goods companies, the General Mills and the Pepsis and the Coca-Colas and the McDonald's and the Nestle's, but as the intermediary in that transaction, the number of expectations that are being placed on us. Walmart has undertaken this billion-ton effort. Most of the actual effort to achieve Walmart's billion-ton greenhouse gas takeout is going to fall back on their supply chains, and the biggest share of it's going to fall back on the agricultural supply chain. And there are farmers that want to be part of those supply chains. And recently, Cargill announced a blockchain technology that put into full use would be a way to document changes in behaviors by farmers and try to grant credit. There are few cases where we are being paid premiums by consumer packaged goods companies to buy grain only from farmers that follow a certain set of prescribed practices. And so it's not a chorus yet, Jan, but
Right.
This is not a dead subject, or one that it's the urban and the enlightened preaching to people on the farms that you guys better do something about this. There are a lot of farmers out there that want to do something about it and have already started, but it is an outdoor sport, and it's a sport where we compete because the export market in the end establishes a huge proportion of the price that farmers receive, and we need to have messages, and this is to tie it back in with what conversations we have with congressmen, is we have to think about how simultaneously to do this without it being regressive, because clearly a carbon tax is a consumption tax. Okay? It's not a VAT tax per se, but it has all the implications of any other consumption tax. And the reason you're doing it is to get people to use less of it. So
Right.
achieving its purpose, but you need to have it achieve its purpose without outsized impacts on certain demographics, i.e. primary commodity farmers reliant on export markets and urban blue collar.
Yeah.
And so that's where the conversations, they go from the climate to the economic, to the agronomic, to the political. And then inevitably, the political comes down to who's going to pay for this change in our behavior and who's going to receive the benefit.
So I'm going to read out some of the chats and make sure that everybody's comments here, we have a chance to address them. I have a whole lot of questions that I'll come back to if we have time. I'm not really sure what this means. Linda, it's from Linda, and she may want to elaborate, but she's asking, what does carbon neutral agriculture look like?
Not an agronomist and not a soil scientist. That for me it means, and in the general ag media that you read about, and some of the research work going on here at the University of Minnesota that I have a chance to interact with the people working on it, it literally is by measuring the amount of retained root structure and things below the surface that are left at the end of a crop, and the amount of greenhouse gas. So you take the fuel consumed, you take the natural gas used to produce the nitrogen fertilizer, and you calculate a carbon footprint input, and then you measure the crops taken away and the amount of carbon left below soil. So for certain crops, more or less, the amount of the plant that you see above the ground and the amount of plant that resides below is close to equal. That isn't always the case for sure, but a carbon, oversimplified by far, a carbon neutral agriculture would be one where you could demonstrate the amount of carbon dioxide taken out of the air through photosynthesis and embedded into the root structure of plants versus the amount of greenhouse gas created by the agricultural practices, the number of gallons of diesel fuel burned by the implements, etc., that you could demonstrate that you were carbon neutral. So it's pure math.
Interesting. Does that account for the I guess it would, the greenhouse gas emissions that are avoided as a result of changed practices? Greater carbon.
I think you have to decide what would be there, but for the crops. The whole thing breaks down for me when people, having lost the argument about carbon neutral agriculture, and they go back to this indirect land use. Okay, so if I always start with the premise that was shared with me by a scientist at Lawrence Livermore Labs who said that his biggest annoyance is people saying that we need to do this for the planet. He said the planet's going to be just fine. We're only doing all this for us.
Exactly.
The planet has seen far worse than anything we're going to impose on it, and it will adapt and adjust. The question is whether we will leave ourselves in an uninhabitable situation. And so if you start with the planet's going to be fine, and the fact that we've elected by one policy or another to have 7 or 8 or 9 billion people, I think the whole indirect land usage issue becomes a little bit moot unless you're willing to view all the people as expendable. So Linda, you should feel free to, ask for any elaboration if you'd like. Here's a question from Roger. How do you foresee the current tax debate affecting taxpayer willingness to contribute that $200 a month for the next 33 years? Yeah. I think it is an education to all of us about how rigorous the debate would be. There was an op-ed piece, I think Greg Mancoop in the New York Times this weekend, saying that the way to resolve this whole circular debate that was kicked off today in Washington was to have a carbon tax be the solution. But clearly you're going to lose a lot of people if you use the carbon tax to fund the government. Then I think you're changing the whole discussion about, is this something we're doing because it's necessary and moral work, or is this just a convenient way to settle the accounts of a debate that we're unwilling to have honestly about tax income or property or inheritance?
Right, that's interesting. So Klaus, I think it's Modger, although I'm not sure, Klaus, I apologize. He comments, we learned that farmers need to use crop rotation, no-till methods, cover crops, the use of legumes to carbonize the soil. And we learned that there are considerable barriers linked to the current supply chain, in particular contract farming, that make it difficult for farmers to optimize stewardship over their stewardship over the land. How do you see the industry support? How do you see industry support farmers with adjusted sourcing strategies? In other words, So I guess I'm interpreting that. How do you support those farmers that are building up that organic matter that is indicated.
Right. Yeah, and it goes back to the discussion I made earlier that can we do this? Yes. Is it likely to be free? No. And from a macroeconomic, the world, we've cut the proportion of the GDP pie that goes to farmers in half. Now, part of that has been made, or a big part of it's been made possible by increases in productivity. And so on any acre of land, we produce dramatically more food than we did even 25 years ago. And so it's not a one-for-one loss, but the world has benefited. Instead of only having 96% of the GDP to use for education, housing, entertainment, travel, and healthcare, they now have 98%. And as we've seen in this whole tax debate, is when you attempt to take away 2% of somebody's well-being, they will push back significantly. And so to Klaus's question, all of the practices that he lists will be deployed if we're going to achieve this closer to or a fully carbon neutral agriculture. The cost of it will be borne somewhere, either by consumers, by farmers, through lower values for their farmland. That basically the price of land is just the discounted value of what you can make on it. And so if you have to every third year grow a low value legume crop to restore your nitrogen, the 3-year total of GDP created by your land will be smaller. And we can decide who should pay that and how they will pay it. But we find ourselves at an interesting time where most of the food companies, the packaged food companies, under enormous pressure by people that shop digitally, that are using alternative supply chains to obtain their food. And so the margin pressure on the people that buy the agricultural commodities, i.e. the consumers, is significant. That you can go back even 20 years ago, and the percentage of shoppers that shopped at the same store every week was probably 50% higher than it is today. And so in a world where the demand is very transient, the kind of hyper competitiveness that we've seen in the food business in the last 10 years gets more significantly exaggerated. And so there's no easy answer to Klaus's question, but if we grow our food in a more expensive manner, just like if we produce our electricity in a more expensive manner, someone will have to pay that incremental cost of a more expensive supply chain. Now, there are benefits to the commons, and there are potential benefits to the climate that agriculture operates in, but those are going to be long-term and slowly developing. But clearly, more expensive electricity, just like more expensive food, the burden of that will be borne. And I don't have a crisp answer by whom, but I think we can all presume that most significantly it'll be borne by the consumers of those products.
Yeah, so I'm gonna invite Klaus to weigh in if he'd like on that. But we talked a lot, and I think I am not at all glib on these topics, but we've talked a lot about more regional food systems, or the food hubs, and talked a little bit about the vertical integration of the supply chains. And I think the question that comes up that might be related to this comment from Klaus in your response is there, how big of a role is there, in your view, for what we have heard about, which is sort of a movement among a lot of sometimes very large, even Midwest commodity farmers, to diversify their farms in a way that builds organic matter, involves all those other, crop rotations, no-till, in most cases livestock on the land.
That to me has been the most interesting one, Jan, is that
Okay.
most of the successful cover crop programs and rotational programs have involved putting more livestock back out there. And yet there are many voices in the climate community that view meat as the evil amongst all evils. And so it has been interesting to me to watch the high proportion. And I was just at an event with the Pheasants Forever people about 2 weeks ago, and they had an agronomist from South Dakota State University, and he was extolling the virtues of some of the things that they've been doing out there, and they're really impressive. But they all involve putting more beef cattle back into South Dakota.
So, Klaus, did you want to weigh in? Klaus?
First, yeah. Klaus Mager here, Greg, from Oregon, Bend, Oregon. We are in the middle of doing a project with EcoTrust, who has written a report entitled the Oregon Food Infrastructure Gap Analysis. Very well, I mean, massive study really, funded by the Myers Foundation. And they highlighted the lack of logistics and aggregation services in particular that hamper small-scale farmers. So an interesting statistic here is that 2% of total farm output in Oregon comes from farms producing less than $100,000 in sales, but they occupy 13% of agricultural land. So I have talked with a number of farmers. In fact, I just came back this afternoon from a farm operation here, and they're all stymied, whether they are produce farmers, lack of access to slaughter facilities, or in produce or legumes or whatever it is. They really can't get into the market because of the procurement practices of large chains like Costco, Walmart, Kroger, and so on. And what this research really indicates is that we have to either build some sort of local food hub, intermediate logistics structure, or we have to get larger retail formations to change their sourcing strategies, sort of going back to the future kind of thing. What can the farm produce, as opposed to ordering very specific crops in very specific time periods? And that seems to be a much larger issue, because you're familiar with the 4 per 1,000 initiative that the French government has initiated, Paris Accord. Yep. In order to achieve that, I mean, the farm itself has to see some pretty impactful changes in the way that we manage the land. And so that question popped up in our previous discussions, and we were wondering, what is your perspective on shifting sourcing strategies from large conglomerates here?
Yeah. This is going to be harsh, Klaus, but you'll probably remember it longer. That to me, the shifting procurement strategies is just another way of saying that this is going to be more expensive than what we do today. And Costco or Walmart or whoever has said, until I have consumers that will pay me more for that, I don't have. And it may appear that Walmart makes a lot of money, but in the context of the global food system, they do not have the capacity to levitate the food system. That all of those expressions are simple expressions of, yes, it costs more. You go to Africa and see the logistics costs, but then we, as the person that buys cocoa from 300 or 350,000 farmers a year, and at the first level, the farmer may be selling you 150 kilos or something, and you have to cut a check, and you have to grade it, and you have to weigh it. And all of the realities of economies of scale come clearly into your view, and it's frustrating. And at the same time, there is this trade-off between the kind of agriculture we're going to have and the cost of carrying it out. The second thing I would say on some of the French work is that there's one very important equation. If everybody has their pen, if you put D over Y equals A, and the D is the demand. And in any given year for any given population and any given per capita income, the amount of food demand that agriculture is called on to provide is given to agriculture. That agriculture is not a demand creating activity, it's a demand serving activity. So the demand is given to us, and if you divide that D by Y, you get A, which is the number of acres. And in many of the French, and I haven't read it in great detail, but some of the summaries, under almost any scenario, that they are calling for a set of practices that will provide, yes, less yield per acre. So for any given population, any given demand, what they're doing will sentence hundreds of thousands of hectares of trees to their death, because the world, through price and other mechanisms, will go searching for a place to produce the food that was not produced because of the change in the behavior of farmers that embarked on a path of lower yields. And so many of the discussions that I get into is, I'm really excited about what you're talking about, but show me that the total number of calories produced per acre does not go down, or I don't view your approach as environmentally responsible. If the Y goes down and goes down in broad strokes, then inevitably the number of acres has to go up, because the only irrefutable equation in the global food system is D divided by Y equals acres.
Yeah, I mean that is a dilemma. Do you see pricing mechanisms
Yes.
to help that shift demand?
Yeah, for sure that there will be some. The question is, what share of consumers? That today already there are programs that people that are buying grass-fed beef are paying a premium for it. You can go through a long list of things. Cage-free eggs are more expensive to produce. They have a worse greenhouse gas footprint, but there are people who are willing to pay the premium for the perceived benefits in terms of animal welfare. And so they make a trade-off and they say, all right, I'm willing to have poorer feed conversion and higher housing costs, and to pay a few cents more per dozen for my eggs. But for me, a high personal value is animal welfare. And so we can go into every section of the store and you will find products that achieve price premiums that basically reflect the way in which the crops were grown. And so those price signals are getting there, and people are responding to them. Will it become the mainstream of the food system? I think, Klaus, is the bigger question.
Yeah.
But certainly the price signal, if you give me 100,000 consumers that'll pay $300 an acre more for a certain kind of behavior, I can get a lot of farmers to sign up and to follow each and every one of the rules every single year. The people that are buying the food that's the outgrowth of those practices will have to, provide the capital through price to make that change effective. And it is happening. You see it in sole source cocoa. The list is very long. Just as you walk through a grocery store, the number of embedded supply chain messages that have been delivered through price that have changed the behavior of the farmers that grew what's in those boxes is more pervasive in the store all the time.
So we are getting close to the top of the hour. Here's a one question that's kind of a different topic from Richard.
And Jan, when that's over, this is Tom, I'd like to ask a question so Greg could perhaps reiterate something that I thought was very powerful when he was speaking to our representative. So hold on.
Okay, I think perhaps we should go ahead and go to that, because we only just have maybe like 5 more minutes. So I'd say
Sure,
go
well,
ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So, Craig, I know that the moment that I found most powerful when we were speaking to our representative, and perhaps you could reiterate that here so they can hear it from you instead of, the few people have heard it from me. I recall you mentioning or just speaking very directly to our representative that we had three choices. We could, for any of the, we could use subsidies, we could use regulation, or we could use price. And what I've been quoting you at, maybe this was close enough, was that price is the only thing that scales. And so there's a lot of opportunity to figure out, how, but we've got so many people that are still kind of stuck on there isn't anything but regulation. And so if you could just speak to that, those three choices and how you saw one as the most powerful, that I think that would help.
Yes, I think Tom has said it, that there are three ways to change behavior. One is through, you can compel people. You can just change the rules and compel. And there are people in the Farm Bill debate that will take place in the U.S., and you probably had that mentioned in your webinars, that will ask that in exchange for participation in the farm programs that there will be a code of conduct. And I think the clear intention would be that that code of conduct would become stricter and stricter over time. So that's what I call, you can compel. You can just tell a farmer, this is how you will farm. The second is you can incent either through a subsidy. If you will cease to fertilize in the fall in exchange for the cleaner water that we get and the better utilization of our fertilizer, we will pay you $23 an acre if you will side dress and apply the fertilizer 4 times a year instead of once. And you can just go through a list. So you can incentivize through price a set of behaviors, and you can essentially hire a farmer to farm in a different manner. The other one is you can tax things and cause things to change. You could put 100% tax on fertilizer, which would clearly change the practices used to distribute it and place it vis-a-vis the root structure of the plant. And suddenly buying a $400,000 or $500,000 planter from John Deere would go from reasonable economics to really compelling economics because the sheer value of the fertilizer had become so dear. So you can incent in 2 ways. You can subsidize what you want to get, or you can tax what you want less of, and then people will adjust around that. And the third is what Klaus has talked about and others, which is this idea of collective action. And so it's consumers raising their voice and asking General Mills to only buy oats from farmers that do a certain set of behaviors, and General Mills deciding there's such a high proportion of the people that buy our product doing that we're going to ask that of the people in the supply chain, and they would go to the Cargills and others, and we would go to the farmers and say, if you want to sell your oats to General Mills, these are the things that consumers are asking us to do. And so I would call that collective civil action. So those are the three choices, or some mix of the three. But absent that, I think altruism has historically not scaled in issues as big as feeding 9 billion people.
Thanks. So regulations, right? It trying to force only gets so much.
So don't call it regulation. You just compel people.
Right. Thanks.
So you can compel behavior, you can incent behavior, or you can enlist behavior through collective action.
Okay.
Three choices.
So
a
final question. Someone is wanting us to make sure we get this one in, and this is given the warming trajectory that we're now on, how close are we to exceeding the temperature tolerances of commodity crops, and how much is that factoring into the argument? And Richard,
I think we're not. I think we're not very.
The question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do fully. I get it often. I don't think we are that close to it, but where we are is in a world where clearly in any given area our weather is more volatile. So in a world like that, the food system necessarily becomes more interdependent. And I think some of these efforts to overly localize, and this is not to argue against in-season crops growing in climates where they're fit for purpose and which is how people ate for years in the absence of refrigeration and retort canning. So I'm a big proponent of localization, but at the level of feeding everyone, the interdependence of the food system is going to become enormous because the climate is going to place that upon us. And it's interesting and frightening to me that at the exact time that we have a more interdependent food system being forced on us by climate, that the political voices are going the opposite direction and making the trade in food less fluid. And so I think from a policy standpoint, if I only had an hour to spend, I would spend it on that issue because it's an immediate, you don't need to wait around and see. To the scientific question that was asked, I think the benefit of working at Cargill and seeing people grow corn on the equator, I don't see the weather in Des Moines getting, in any time in this century, getting as demanding as some of the weather that we face in the Brazilian Cerrado, and yet we are able, with changes in genetics and agronomic practices and rotational policies, we're able to extract significant amount of food even under those conditions. So I think in terms of running out of the ability to harness photosynthesis to feed everyone, I think we're quite a distance away. I don't think it's shaping the debate. Yeah, if it were, I think people would be taking this whole thing more seriously, but the facts are, I don't think it's a threat at this time. What I do think is a threat is the likelihood that the cost to grow our food as a percent of GDP is going to begin to go back up after decades and decades of declining. It's probably pretty closely upon us.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour. This